The doors of the small church in Gunnison, Colorado swung open with a force that made every head turn. And in that moment, Julia Newfield knew with absolute certainty that Marcus Thornton was not coming to marry her. The summer sun of 1878 blazed through the open doorway, casting long shadows across the wooden pews, filled with townspeople who had come to witness what should have been the wedding of the year. Julia stood at the altar in her mother's cream-colored wedding dress, the lace carefully mended and pressed for this occasion. Her hands trembled as she clutched the small bouquet of wildflowers her younger sister had picked that morning. The Reverend shifted uncomfortably beside her, his Bible open to the page he had marked for the ceremony. "Maybe he's just running late," someone whispered from the third row. Julia recognized the voice as belonging to Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress who had adjusted the dress to fit Julia's slender frame. But Julia knew better. She had seen the way Marcus had been looking at her over the past month, with less certainty and more hesitation. She had felt the distance growing between them like a canyon widening with each passing day. Still, she had convinced herself it was merely pre-wedding nerves. They had been engaged for 8 months, ever since Marcus had returned from a cattle drive with enough money to finally propose. He was the son of the wealthiest rancher in the county, and Julia was the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died 3 years prior. Her father now worked at the general store, barely making enough to support Julia and her 2 younger siblings. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give him a few more minutes." Julia felt the heat rising to her cheeks, the embarrassment settling over her like a heavy blanket. She could feel every eye in the church boring into her back. The whispers were growing louder now, no longer attempts at discretion but open speculation about where the groom could be. "This is disgraceful," someone muttered. "That poor girl. I always knew Marcus Thornton had a yellow streak." Julia's father stood from his seat in the front row and approached her, his weathered face etched with concern. Thomas Newfield was a man of 50 years, his hair more gray than brown now, his hands rough from years of physical labor. "Julia, sweetheart, maybe we should wait," Julia said firmly, though her voice wavered. "Let's wait a little longer." But even as she said it, she felt something inside her crack. The hope she had been clinging to was slipping through her fingers like sand. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The murmurs in the church grew into full conversations. Some people began to stand, uncomfortable with the spectacle they were witnessing. Then the door opened again, and Julia's heart leaped. But it was not Marcus who entered. It was his younger brother, Daniel, looking pale and nervous. He walked quickly down the aisle, and Julia felt her last shred of hope disintegrate. "Miss Newfield," Daniel said quietly when he reached her. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the hushed church it carried. "Marcus asked me to give you this." He held out a folded piece of paper. Julia stared at it for a long moment before taking it with shaking fingers. She unfolded it slowly, aware that everyone was watching, waiting. The words blurred before her eyes, but she forced herself to read them. "Julia, I cannot go through with this. I am sorry. I have left town and do not know when I will return. Please forgive me. Marcus." The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. The silence in the church was deafening. Julia felt the world spinning around her, felt her knees beginning to buckle. This could not be happening. This was not real. "Everyone should go home," the Reverend said loudly, his voice breaking through Julia's shock. "There will be no wedding today." But before anyone could move, before the whispers could turn into a roar of gossip, a figure stood up from the back of the church. Julia barely registered the movement through her tears, but she heard the sound of boots against the wooden floor, steady and purposeful. Gideon Fletcher had been in Gunnison for only 3 months. He worked as a ranch hand at the Morrison Spread, a smaller operation about 5 miles outside of town. He was a quiet man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. At 26 years old, he had already lived more life than most men twice his age. He had been a soldier in the Indian Wars, had driven cattle from Texas to Montana, had prospected for gold in the Black Hills, and had learned that true wealth was not measured in dollars but in character. He had noticed Julia Newfield the first time he came into town for supplies. She had been leaving the general store with her arms full of parcels, and when one had slipped, he had caught it before it hit the ground. She had smiled at him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and thanked him. They had spoken for only a moment, but it had been enough for Gideon to know that she was different from any woman he had ever met. When he learned she was engaged to Marcus Thornton, he had felt a pang of disappointment but had pushed it aside. A woman like that deserved to be happy, and if she had chosen Marcus, then that was that. Still, he found himself attending church more regularly just to see her, to hear her voice when she sang the hymns. Now, watching her stand at that altar, humiliated and heartbroken, something inside Gideon moved. He could not explain it, could not rationalize it, but he knew with absolute certainty what he needed to do. He walked down the aisle with steady steps, his hat in his hands. Every eye turned to watch him. Whispers erupted again, confused and curious. Julia looked up as he approached, her blue eyes swimming with tears, her face pale. "Miss Newfield," Gideon said quietly when he reached her. His voice was deep and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around them. "I know this is not how you planned for today to go. I know you do not know me well, but if you will have me, I will marry you right here, right now." The church erupted into gasps and shocked exclamations. Julia stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Her father stepped forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and protectiveness. "Now see here, young man," Thomas began, but Gideon kept his eyes on Julia. "I am not a rich man, Miss Newfield. I work hard for my wages and I have little to offer except my word. But I give you my word that I will honor you, provide for you, and never bring you shame the way you have been shamed today. You do not have to love me. You do not even have to like me. But you do not deserve to walk out of this church as the woman who was left at the altar." Julia's mind was reeling. She looked at this man, this stranger who had just offered her the most unexpected lifeline. She recognized him vaguely from around town, remembered him tipping his hat to her once or twice, but they had never had a real conversation. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. "Why would you do this?" Julia managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "Because it is the right thing to do," Gideon replied simply. "Because you deserve better than what you have been given today." The Reverend stepped forward, looking uncertain. "This is highly irregular." "So is a groom not showing up for his own wedding," Gideon said without taking his eyes off Julia. "Reverend, you have a bride, a church full of witnesses, and a willing groom. I would say everything is in place for a wedding." Julia felt her father's hand on her shoulder. She turned to look at him, searching his face for guidance. Thomas looked at Gideon for a long moment, then back at his daughter. "It is your choice, Julia," Thomas said quietly. "I will support whatever you decide." Julia turned back to Gideon. Her hands had stopped shaking. The tears had dried on her cheeks. She thought about walking out of this church unwed, about facing the pitying looks and the whispered gossip. She thought about her father's meager income and her responsibility to help provide for her younger siblings. She thought about Marcus, who had not even had the courage to face her himself. And then she thought about this man standing before her, this stranger who had just offered her dignity when everyone else had been content to watch her suffer. "I do not know you," Julia said. "No," Gideon agreed, "but we have time to change that." Julia took a deep breath. She looked down at the bouquet still clutched in her hands, then back up at Gideon. "What is your full name?" "Gideon Samuel Fletcher." "Where are you from?" "Kentucky originally, but I have not been back there in 8 years." "You have family?" "A sister in St. Louis." "She is married with 3 children." "Why are you in Gunnison?" "I needed work. The Morrison Ranch needed hands. It seemed like a good place to settle for a while." Julia nodded slowly. These were not the questions she should be asking a man before marrying him, but they were a start. She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity there. No pity, no mockery, no hidden agenda. Just an honest offer from an honest man. "I am 18 years old," Julia said. "I help my father at the store, I like to read, and I sing in the church choir. I have a temper when provoked, and I am stubborn to a fault." A small smile tugged at the corner of Gideon's mouth. "Those sound like fine qualities to me." Julia felt something shift inside her. It was not love, not yet, but it was something. A spark of possibility. A glimmer of hope in the midst of her humiliation. She extended her hand to him. "Then let us marry, Gideon Fletcher." Gideon took her hand gently, and Julia felt the warmth and strength in his grip. He had calluses on his palms from hard work, and his hand completely engulfed hers. But his touch was careful, respectful. The Reverend looked between them, then shook his head in wonder. "Well, I have never in all my years performed a ceremony quite like this, but if you both are certain, we are," Gideon said firmly. "Julia?" the Reverend asked. Julia squeezed Gideon's hand. "Yes, we are certain." The Reverend nodded and opened his Bible again. The church had gone completely silent, everyone transfixed by the turn of events. Julia's father returned to his seat, and Julia caught her younger sister Sarah's eye. Sarah, who was 16 and far more romantic than Julia, was beaming through her tears. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, and Julia felt the surreal nature of the moment wash over her. Just minutes ago she had been a jilted bride. Now she was marrying a man whose last name she had learned only moments before. The ceremony was brief. Julia barely heard the words, her mind too full of shock and strange relief. When the Reverend asked if she took Gideon to be her lawfully wedded husband, she said, "I do," in a clear voice that did not waver. When Gideon repeated the words, his voice was steady and sure. "You have a ring?" the Reverend asked Gideon. Julia had forgotten about the ring. Marcus was supposed to have brought the ring, but Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. It was plain, unadorned, but when he slipped it onto Julia's finger, it fit perfectly. "It was my mother's," Gideon said quietly. "She gave it to me before she passed, and told me to give it to a woman worthy of wearing it. I cannot think of anyone more worthy than you." Julia felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had shed earlier. These were tears of unexpected emotion, of gratitude for this stranger's kindness. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said, sounding both bemused and moved. "You may kiss your bride." Gideon looked at Julia, and she saw the question in his eyes. He would not presume, would not force anything. Julia gave a small nod, and Gideon leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. It was brief, chaste, but Julia felt the warmth of it all the way through her body. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the church erupted into confused applause. Some people looked scandalized, others moved, still others simply shocked. But Julia held her head high as she walked back down the aisle on Gideon's arm, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow. Outside the church, the bright sunlight seemed even more intense. Julia blinked against it, feeling as though she had stepped out of one life and into another entirely. People began filing out of the church, surrounding them with questions and congratulations. "Well, that was something," Mrs. Patterson said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Most exciting wedding I have ever attended." Julia's father emerged from the church with Sarah and her younger brother, 10-year-old Timothy. Thomas approached Gideon with an appraising look. "Mr. Fletcher, I think you and I need to have a conversation," Thomas said. "Yes, sir," Gideon agreed. "I would expect nothing less. But first, I suppose we should proceed with the wedding supper," Thomas continued. "Julia's Aunt Mary has been preparing food all week, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste." Julia had forgotten about the reception. It was supposed to be held at the town hall, a modest celebration with food and dancing. The thought of going through with it now, after everything that had happened, seemed impossible. "Father, maybe we should just go home," Julia began, but Thomas shook his head. "You are married now, Julia. That is something to celebrate, no matter how unorthodox the circumstances. Besides, this town loves gossip. Let us give them something positive to talk about." Gideon looked at Julia. "It is up to you. Whatever you want to do, I will support." Julia considered for a moment. Part of her wanted to run and hide, to process everything that had just happened in private. But another part of her, the stubborn part she had warned Gideon about, refused to let Marcus's abandonment define this day. "Let us go to the reception," Julia said decisively. "You are right, Father. We are married, and that is worth celebrating." The town hall was decorated with wildflowers and ribbons, all prepared by Julia's aunt and the other women of the church. Long tables were laden with food: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from local gardens, pies and cakes. It should have been a feast for Julia and Marcus. Instead, it became a celebration of Julia and Gideon. The atmosphere was strange at first, people uncertain how to behave. But as the afternoon wore on and the shock began to wear off, the mood lifted. Someone brought out a fiddle, and music filled the hall. Children ran around between the tables while adults talked and ate. Gideon stayed close to Julia's side, attentive but not overbearing. He seemed comfortable with silence, content to let Julia take the lead in conversations. When her Aunt Mary approached with a knowing smile, Julia braced herself. "Well, Julia, you certainly know how to keep things interesting," Mary said. She was Julia's mother's older sister, a warm-hearted woman who had helped raise Julia and her siblings after their mother's death. "This young man swept you right off your feet, did he not?" "Something like that," Julia said, unsure how to explain what had actually happened. Mary patted Gideon's arm. "You take good care of my niece, you hear. She has been through enough." "I intend to, madam," Gideon said with a slight nod. As the afternoon progressed, Julia found herself studying her new husband. He was polite to everyone who approached them, humble when the men complimented his bold action, respectful when the women offered their advice for marital happiness. He had an ease about him, a quiet confidence that came from knowing who he was and being comfortable with it. When the dancing began, Gideon turned to Julia. "Would you like to dance?" Julia hesitated. She loved to dance, but the intimacy of it suddenly felt overwhelming. Still, people were watching, and she knew it would look strange if they refused. "Yes," she said, taking his offered hand. Gideon led her to the center of the hall where other couples were already swaying to the music. He placed one hand on her waist and held her other hand in his. As they began to move, Julia was surprised by how well he danced. He led confidently but gently, guiding her through the steps with ease. "You dance well," Julia observed. "My mother insisted on teaching me," Gideon replied. "She said a man who could not dance was only half civilized." Despite everything, Julia felt a smile tugging at her lips. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I wish you could have known her. They danced in silence for a few moments, and Julia became aware of how close they were, how she could feel the solid strength of him, smell the faint scent of soap and leather. It was strange and not unpleasant. "I want to thank you," Julia said quietly, "for what you did today." Gideon looked down at her, his gray eyes serious. "You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You saved me from a humiliation I am not sure I could have recovered from." "Julia," Gideon said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, "I did not marry you out of pity. I want you to know that." "Then why did you do it?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because from the moment I saw you, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes on. Because every time I heard you laugh, it brightened my entire day. Because when I saw you standing at that altar, heartbroken and alone, I knew I could not let you go through that without doing something." Julia's breath caught. She had expected him to say something noble about duty or propriety. She had not expected such raw honesty. "You do not even know me," Julia said, echoing her earlier words. "Then let us get to know each other," Gideon said. "We have the rest of our lives to do so. The rest of our lives." The weight of those words settled over Julia. She was married to this man. They would build a life together, share a home, possibly have children. It was what she had thought she wanted with Marcus, but this was different. This was not based on courtship and expectations. This was born from a moment of crisis and an act of unexpected kindness. When the song ended, they stepped apart. Julia saw her father watching them from across the room, his expression thoughtful. She excused herself from Gideon and made her way over to Thomas. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, pulling her aside where they could speak privately. "I think so," Julia said honestly. "I am still trying to understand what just happened." "I spoke with some of the men who know Mr. Fletcher," Thomas said. "They all speak highly of him. They say he is a hard worker, honest, keeps to himself mostly. Has a reputation for being fair in his dealings." "That is good to know," Julia said, feeling a small measure of relief. At least she had not married a complete unknown. "But Julia," Thomas continued, his voice gentle, "I need to know that you truly wanted this. If you felt pressured or cornered—" "No, father," Julia interrupted. "I made the choice. I will not pretend it was not a hasty one, or that I was not influenced by the circumstances. But I made it nonetheless, and I intend to honor it." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "You are so much like your mother. She was always the strongest person I knew, even when life tried to break her." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. She missed her mother desperately in moments like this. Margaret Newfield had died of pneumonia one brutal winter, leaving behind a grief-stricken husband and 3 children. Julia had stepped into her mother's role as best she could, helping to raise Sarah and Timothy while assisting her father with whatever work she could find. "What do I do now?" Julia asked quietly. "You go forward," Thomas said simply. "You build a life with your husband. You find happiness where you can. And you remember that love is not always something that strikes like lightning. Sometimes it grows slowly, like a seed planted in good soil." As the evening wore on and the sky outside darkened, Julia felt exhaustion creeping over her. It had been the longest day of her life, emotionally and mentally draining. When Gideon appeared at her side again, she was grateful. "You look tired," he observed. "I am," Julia admitted. "Then perhaps we should leave." Julia had been trying not to think about what came next. She and Marcus had planned to spend their wedding night at the hotel in town before leaving for a brief trip to Denver. But those plans were no longer relevant. "Where are we going?" Julia asked. Gideon hesitated. "I have a small cabin about 3 miles from town. It is not much, just 1 room, but it is clean and sturdy. I built it myself when I first arrived. We can stay there, or if you would prefer, I can arrange for us to stay at the hotel. Julia thought about it. The hotel would be more comfortable, but it would also mean staying in town where everyone could watch and whisper. The cabin, whatever its condition, offered privacy. The cabin, Julia decided. Gideon nodded. I will bring the wagon around. Julia said her goodbyes to her family. Sarah hugged her tightly, whispering in her ear, "He is very handsome, Julia, and what he did was so romantic." Julia could not help but smile at her sister's enthusiasm. It was certainly something. Timothy, too young to fully understand what had transpired, simply hugged her and asked, "Does this mean you will not be living with us anymore?" The question broke Julia's heart a little. "No, sweetheart. I will be living with my husband, but I will visit often, I promise." Her father was the last to say goodbye. He embraced her warmly and whispered, "Be happy, Julia. You deserve it." Gideon helped Julia into the wagon, her wedding dress making the task awkward. He had retrieved his horse from the livery and tied it to the back of the wagon. As they left town, the noise of the reception fading behind them, Julia felt the reality of her situation settling over her like a cloak. She was married to a stranger. She was leaving the only home she had known to live in a cabin in the wilderness. Her entire life had changed in the span of a few hours. The ride was quiet, the only sounds the clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. The moon was nearly full, casting silvery light over the landscape. Julia could see mountains in the distance, dark shapes against the starlit sky. "Are you cold?" Gideon asked, noticing her shiver. "A little," Julia admitted. Gideon reached behind him and pulled out a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. The gesture was thoughtful, and Julia found herself grateful for it. "Tell me about your cabin," Julia said, needing to fill the silence with something. "It is nothing fancy," Gideon said. "Just one large room with a fireplace, a table and chairs, a bed. There is a small barn for the horses and a chicken coop. I have a garden out back where I grow vegetables. The creek is about 50 yards away, so water is easy to come by." "It sounds peaceful," Julia said. "It is. I like the quiet. After years of moving from place to place, it is nice to have somewhere that feels like home." They fell silent again, and Julia found herself wondering about this man's past. What had driven him to leave Kentucky? What had he seen in his years of wandering? What secrets did he carry? But those were questions for another time. Right now, she was too tired and too overwhelmed to process anything more. When they arrived at the cabin, Julia saw that Gideon had been modest in his description. It was indeed small, but even in the moonlight, she could see that it was well built and well maintained. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and warm light glowed through the single window. "I left the fire burning this morning," Gideon explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "I did not expect to be bringing home a wife, but at least the cabin is warm." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. The floor was clean, the furniture handmade but sturdy. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. There was indeed only one bed, pushed against the far wall, covered with a colorful quilt. Julia stood in the center of the room, suddenly very aware that she was alone with her husband for the first time. Gideon seemed to sense her nervousness. "You must be exhausted," he said gently. "Why do not you get ready for bed? I need to tend to the horses." He left before Julia could respond, giving her privacy. Julia let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She looked around the cabin, trying to imagine this as her home. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, well worn and obviously read many times. A rifle hung over the door, and saddles and other tack were stored neatly in one corner. Julia began the awkward process of removing her wedding dress. The buttons were in the back, and she struggled with them, wishing Sarah were there to help. She managed to get most of them undone and stepped out of the dress, folding it carefully and laying it over one of the chairs. She was wearing only her chemise and petticoats when she heard Gideon's boots on the porch. She quickly grabbed the quilt from the bed and wrapped it around herself just as he opened the door. Gideon paused when he saw her, then averted his eyes respectfully. "I should have thought to give you more time. I apologize." "It is all right," Julia said, though her cheeks burned with embarrassment. Gideon moved to the fireplace, adding another log. "Julia, I want you to know that I do not expect anything from you tonight, or any night for that matter. We are married in the eyes of the law and the church, but I understand that this is not a normal marriage. I will sleep on the floor and you can have the bed." Julia looked at the bed, then at Gideon. He was serious, she realized. He truly intended to sleep on the hard floor while she took the only bed. "That does not seem fair," Julia said quietly. "Fair or not, it is how it will be," Gideon said firmly. "At least until you feel comfortable with other arrangements." Julia did not know what to say. She had spent the past 8 months preparing herself mentally for her wedding night with Marcus, and now here she was with a different man entirely, one who was offering her something she had not expected: respect and patience. "Thank you," Julia finally said, "for everything. For today, for this, for understanding." Gideon met her eyes and Julia saw warmth there. "We have time, Julia. There is no rush for anything." Julia climbed into the bed, still wearing her chemise, and pulled the quilt over her. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with what felt like corn husks. The pillow smelled like lavender. Gideon extinguished the lamp, leaving only the firelight, and made himself a pallet on the floor using blankets from a trunk. "Good night, Julia," Gideon said from his spot near the fireplace. "Good night, Gideon," Julia replied. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the fire crackle and Gideon's breathing even out as he fell asleep. She thought about Marcus, wondered where he had gone and why he had truly left. But the thoughts were distant, as if they belonged to someone else. What occupied her mind more was the man sleeping on the floor a few feet away, the man who had married her without knowing her, who had given her dignity when she had none left. Julia did not know what the future held. She did not know if she could ever love Gideon the way a wife should love her husband. But she knew one thing with certainty: Gideon Fletcher was a good man, and she would do everything in her power to be a good wife to him. With that thought, Julia finally closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. The morning sun streamed through the window, waking Julia from a deep sleep. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, looking around the cabin. Gideon was not there. His pallet had been neatly rolled up and stored away. The fire had been stoked, and Julia could smell coffee brewing in a pot hanging over the flames. On the table, she found fresh water in a basin, presumably for washing, and a note written in neat, careful handwriting. "Good morning. I have gone to the Morrison Ranch to speak with my employer about my situation. There is bread in the cupboard and eggs from the chickens. I will return by midday. Make yourself at home. Gideon." Julia smiled at the note, touched by his thoughtfulness. She washed her face in the basin, grateful for the warm water, and dressed in one of the 2 everyday dresses she had brought with her. Someone, probably her aunt, had packed a bag with some of her belongings and loaded it into the wagon. Julia found it near the door and was relieved to see her hairbrush, a change of clothes, and a few personal items. She explored the cabin more thoroughly in the morning light. It was clean and organized, everything in its place. The books on the shelf were an eclectic mix: poetry, philosophy, adventure novels, even a medical text. Julia pulled out a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets and smiled. Marcus had never been much of a reader. Julia found the bread and eggs Gideon had mentioned and prepared herself a simple breakfast. She ate at the small table, looking out the window at the landscape around the cabin. It was beautiful, she had to admit. Pine trees surrounded the property, and beyond them she could see open meadows dotted with wildflowers. The mountains in the distance were majestic, their peaks still capped with snow even in July. After eating, Julia washed the dishes and then ventured outside. The morning was cool but pleasant, the air crisp and clean. She found the chicken coop and collected eggs, counting 6 fat hens clucking contentedly. The garden was thriving, full of squash, beans, tomatoes, and herbs. Someone had been taking good care of it. Julia walked down to the creek Gideon had mentioned. It was wider than she had expected, the water clear and cold, bubbling over smooth rocks. She sat on the bank for a while, letting the peace of the place wash over her. It was so different from town, where there was always noise and activity, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Here, there was only the sound of the water and the wind in the trees. It was isolating but also freeing. Julia realized that for the first time in her life, she had no one watching her, no expectations to meet, no role to play. She was simply Julia Fletcher, a woman starting a new life with her husband, Julia Fletcher. The name felt strange but not unpleasant. She returned to the cabin and spent the rest of the morning tidying up, though there was little to tidy. She found some mending in a basket near the fireplace and set to work on it, grateful for something to occupy her hands. Gideon's clothes were well made but worn, and she could see where he had repaired them himself with somewhat clumsy stitches. Julia carefully removed his work and replaced it with her own neater stitches, taking satisfaction in the task. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the wagon approach until it was nearly at the door. Julia set aside the mending and smoothed her hair as Gideon entered. "Hello," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you found everything all right this morning." "I did, thank you," Julia replied. "Your note was very helpful." Gideon smiled, and Julia noticed how different he looked when he smiled. The seriousness that usually marked his features softened, making him appear younger. "I spoke with Mr. Morrison," Gideon said. "I explained the situation, and he was very understanding. He has offered us the use of a larger cabin on the far side of his property. It has 2 rooms and is in better repair than this one. He said we could move there if we wanted." Julia considered this. Part of her liked this cabin despite its size. It had a charm to it, a coziness. But she also knew that having 2 rooms would make their unusual situation easier to navigate. "What do you think?" Julia asked. "Honestly, I am content here," Gideon said. "But I want you to be comfortable. If you would prefer more space, we should take the other cabin." "Let us stay here for now," Julia decided. "We can always change our minds later." Gideon nodded, looking pleased. "Mr. Morrison also said I could take a few days away from work, given that I just married. He is a good man." That was kind of him. An awkward silence fell between them. Julia realized that this was the reality of their situation. They were married, but they did not know how to talk to each other, how to be comfortable in each other's presence. "I noticed you have been mending my clothes," Gideon said, gesturing to the basket. "You did not have to do that." "I wanted to," Julia said. "Besides, it gave me something to do. I am not used to idleness." "I imagine this is quite different from your life in town." "Very different," Julia agreed, "but not necessarily worse, just different." They spent the afternoon in a cautious dance around each other, both trying to find their rhythm. Gideon showed Julia where he kept various supplies, explained his routine with the animals and the garden. Julia shared what she was comfortable with, her love of reading, her close relationship with her siblings, her hope to perhaps teach school someday like her mother had. For dinner, Julia prepared a meal from the supplies in the cabin. It was simple fare, fried eggs and vegetables from the garden, but Gideon praised it as if it were a feast. "This is delicious," he said. "Much better than the meals I usually make for myself." "What do you usually make?" Julia asked. "Beans, mostly," Gideon admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "Sometimes I manage a passable stew, but I never quite mastered the art of cooking." "Then I suppose it is fortunate you married someone who can cook," Julia said, and was surprised to hear the teasing note in her own voice. Gideon's smile widened. "Very fortunate indeed." That night, Gideon again made himself a pallet on the floor despite Julia's protests. She lay in bed, listening to him settle in, and felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, for his consideration, but also a growing curiosity about this man she had married. Who was he really? What dreams did he have? What fears, Gideon? Julia said into the darkness. "Yes." "Can you tell me more about yourself, about your past?" There was a long pause, and Julia worried she had overstepped. But then Gideon began to speak, his voice low and thoughtful. "I was born in Kentucky, like I said. My father owned a small farm. I had 3 sisters, but 2 died of fever when they were young. My surviving sister, Margaret, married a banker and moved to St. Louis. My father died when I was 17. My mother remarried a year later to a man who did not want me around, so I left." Julia could hear the pain in his voice, carefully controlled but present nonetheless. "I worked as a ranch hand, a farmhand, whatever I could find," Gideon continued. "Then the war with the Indians intensified and I joined the cavalry. I thought it was the honorable thing to do. I thought we were protecting settlers and bringing civilization." He paused, and Julia heard him take a deep breath. "I was wrong about a lot of things. I saw things in those years that I wish I could forget. I learned that honor and cruelty can exist in the same place, that good men can do terrible things when they are following orders. I left the cavalry as soon as my enlistment was up and swore I would never take up arms for a cause again, unless I believed in it with my whole heart." "That must have been difficult," Julia said softly. "It was. After that, I drifted for a while. I worked cattle drives, tried prospecting, worked in a lumber camp. I was searching for something, though I did not know what. Then I came to Gunnison and found this place, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I could put down roots." "And then you married a stranger," Julia said. "And then I married you," Gideon agreed. "Which is perhaps the least strange thing I have done, all things considered." Julia laughed, surprising herself. "I find that hard to believe. It is true. Marrying you was the easiest decision I have ever made." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Julia felt her heart beat faster. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Because I looked at you and knew that if I let you walk out of that church humiliated and alone, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Because I thought that, if I had even the smallest chance to be part of your life, I should take it. Because something in my heart told me that you were worth any risk." Julia did not know what to say to that. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty. Marcus had courted her with pretty words and promises, but they had been hollow. Gideon's words, simple and unadorned, carried more weight than any of Marcus's elaborate declarations. "I am not sure I am worth all that," Julia finally said. "Then you do not see yourself clearly," Gideon replied. "Good night, Julia." "Good night, Gideon." Julia lay awake long after Gideon's breathing had evened into sleep. She thought about his words, about the faith he had shown in her. She thought about his past, the pain he carried, the journey that had brought him to that church on what should have been the worst day of her life. And she thought about the future, stretching ahead of them like an unmarked trail. She did not know where it would lead, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of excitement rather than fear. The next few days settled into a routine. Gideon worked around the property during the day, repairing the barn roof, reinforcing the chicken coop, clearing more land for the garden. Julia took over the household tasks, cooking and cleaning, tending the garden and the chickens. They were like two separate entities sharing a space, polite and considerate but not yet connected. But slowly, things began to shift. Gideon would come in from working outside, and Julia would have cold water ready for him. She would struggle with carrying water from the creek, and Gideon would appear to help without being asked. They began to talk more during meals, sharing stories from their pasts, discovering common interests. Julia learned that Gideon had a dry sense of humor that surprised her. He could deliver a joke with such a straight face that it took her a moment to realize he was being funny. He learned that Julia had a fierce intelligence and loved to debate ideas, that she had opinions on everything from politics to religion, and was not afraid to voice them. On the fourth day of their marriage, Gideon asked Julia if she would like to ride with him to check on the cattle in the far pasture. Julia, who had been feeling cooped up in the cabin, agreed eagerly. Gideon saddled 2 horses, and they rode out together into the beautiful Colorado morning. The ride took them through meadows filled with wildflowers, past groves of aspen trees with their distinctive white bark. Gideon pointed out landmarks, told her the names of the mountains in the distance. Julia felt the freedom of the open space, the joy of moving through the landscape on horseback. When they reached the pasture, Gideon showed her the cattle grazing peacefully. He explained how the ranch was run, his role in it, his hopes of perhaps saving enough to start his own small spread someday. "I never wanted much," Gideon said as they sat on their horses, looking out over the valley. "Just enough land to call my own, a home, maybe a family. Simple things." "Those do not sound simple to me," Julia said. "They sound like the most important things in the world." Gideon looked at her, and something passed between them. It was not quite love, not yet, but it was connection. It was the recognition that they were no longer strangers, that they were beginning to build something together. On the ride back, Julia's horse stumbled, and she nearly lost her seat. Gideon was beside her in an instant, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I am fine," Julia said, but she was shaken. She had not ridden much recently, and the stumble had caught her off guard. "We should walk the rest of the way," Gideon decided, "just to be safe." They dismounted and walked their horses back to the cabin. It was slower going, but Julia found she did not mind. Gideon walked beside her, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed. Each time it happened, Julia felt a small jolt, an awareness of him that was growing stronger each day. That night, after dinner, Julia sat by the fire with one of Gideon's books while he worked on repairing a bridle. It was a peaceful scene, domestic and comfortable. Julia looked up from her reading and watched him work, noting the way his hands moved with practiced skill, the concentration on his face. "What are you reading?" Gideon asked, noticing her attention. "The Shakespeare sonnets," Julia said. "Do you have a favorite?" Gideon thought for a moment. Sonnet 116. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." Julia was surprised. "You know it by heart." "My mother used to recite it. She loved Shakespeare. She would have liked you." "I wish I could have met her," Julia said, and meant it. "So do I." Julia closed the book and set it aside. "Gideon, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you regret it, marrying me the way you did?" Gideon set down the bridle and met her eyes. "Not for a single moment, do you?" Julia considered the question honestly. Did she regret it? She had married a stranger, upended her entire life, moved to a cabin in the wilderness. But she thought about the alternative, about facing the town's pity and gossip, about living with the shame of being abandoned at the altar. She thought about her father's small house, crowded with 4 people, and the burden her presence added. And she thought about Gideon, about his kindness and patience, his quiet strength. "No," Julia said. "I do not regret it." Gideon smiled, and Julia felt warmth bloom in her chest. "I am glad." As the week progressed, Julia felt herself relaxing into this new life. She wrote a letter to her family, assuring them she was well and happy. Gideon rode into town to post it and returned with supplies and news. "The town is still talking about our wedding," Gideon reported, unpacking the supplies. "Apparently, it is the most exciting thing to happen in Gunnison in years." "I imagine so," Julia said dryly. "Did you hear anything about Marcus?" She was not sure why she asked. She found that she thought about Marcus less and less each day, but curiosity remained. Gideon's expression darkened. "He was spotted in Denver. Apparently, he has been seeing another woman there for months. That is why he left." Julia absorbed this information. She expected to feel hurt or betrayed, but instead she felt only a distant relief. Marcus had done her a favor by leaving. If he had gone through with the wedding, she would be married to a man who did not truly love her, who had been unfaithful even before their marriage. "I am sorry," Gideon said. "I know that must be painful to hear." "Actually, it is not," Julia said honestly. "It confirms that I made the right choice in marrying you. Whatever the circumstances, whatever our reasons, at least we have been honest with each other." Gideon looked at her with something like admiration. "You are stronger than you give yourself credit for, Julia Fletcher." Julia Fletcher. Each time she heard the name, it felt more natural, more right. That night marked a week since their wedding. Gideon had been sleeping on the floor every night without complaint, but Julia could see it was taking a toll. He moved more stiffly in the mornings, and she knew the hard floor could not be comfortable. "Gideon," Julia said as they prepared for bed, "this is ridiculous. The bed is large enough for 2 people. We are married, and while I appreciate your consideration, I cannot continue to let you sleep on the floor." Gideon looked uncertain. "Julia, I do not want you to feel pressured." "I do not feel pressured, I feel practical. We can put pillows between us if it makes you more comfortable, but you are sleeping in the bed tonight." Gideon studied her face, looking for any sign of hesitation. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded. "If you are sure." "I am sure." That night, they lay in the same bed for the first time, a careful distance between them. Julia was acutely aware of his presence, of his warmth, of the sound of his breathing. It was intimate in a way that made her heart race, but it was not frightening. Instead, it felt like another step forward, another small bridge crossed. "Good night, Julia," Gideon said softly. "Good night, Gideon." Julia closed her eyes and, to her surprise, fell asleep almost immediately. She woke once in the night to find she had rolled closer to Gideon in her sleep, her hand almost touching his. She did not move away. The summer days grew warmer as July melted into August. Julia settled more fully into her role as Gideon's wife. She baked bread, tended the garden, made curtains for the cabin's windows from fabric Gideon bought in town. Slowly, the cabin began to feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep. Gideon resumed his regular work at the Morrison Ranch, leaving early in the morning and returning in the evening. Julia found she missed him during the day, looked forward to his return. They fell into an easy routine, sharing meals and conversation, reading together by the fire at night. One Saturday, Julia's family came to visit. Sarah and Timothy tumbled out of the wagon, excited to see Julia's new home. Her father and aunt came as well, bringing gifts, preserves, fabric, a rocking chair that had belonged to Julia's mother. "We wanted you to have something from home," Thomas said as he and Gideon carried the chair into the cabin. Julia was touched beyond words. She hugged her father tightly, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Father." The visit was joyful. Sarah chattered about town gossip. Timothy explored the property with wide eyes, and Aunt Mary inspected the cabin with an approving eye. "You have made a lovely home here, Julia," Mary said. "And that husband of yours is a fine man. I can see it in the way he looks at you." Julia blushed. "We are still getting to know each other." "That may be so, but there is love growing here," Mary said wisely. "I can always tell." During the visit, Thomas pulled Gideon aside for a conversation. Julia watched them from the window, saw her father's serious expression and Gideon's attentive posture. When they came back inside, both men seemed satisfied with whatever had been discussed. After her family left, Julia asked Gideon what her father had said. "He wanted to make sure I was treating you well," Gideon said. "He said if I ever gave him reason to think otherwise, he would hold me accountable. I assured him that I intend to spend my life making you happy." "And what did he say to that?" "He said he could see that I meant it, and that he was glad you had found a good man." Julia felt emotion welling up. Her father's approval meant everything to her. "I am glad too," she said softly. Gideon reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. It was the most deliberately affectionate gesture he had made, and Julia felt her breath catch. His hand lingered for a moment near her face, and she saw the question in his eyes. Julia made a decision. She leaned forward and kissed him, a brief but meaningful press of her lips to his. When she pulled back, Gideon was looking at her with wonder. "Julia," he breathed. "We are married," Julia said, "and I would like us to be truly married, if you want that too." "I want that more than anything," Gideon said, "but only if you are ready, only if you are sure." "I am sure," Julia said, and realized she meant it. Over the past weeks, she had come to know Gideon. She had seen his kindness, his integrity, his patience. She had watched him work hard every day to provide for them, had seen the way he treated her with respect and care. And she had felt something growing in her heart, something that started as gratitude but had bloomed into something deeper. Gideon cupped her face in his hands and kissed her properly, and Julia felt the world narrow to just the two of them. His kiss was gentle but passionate, full of weeks of restrained longing. Julia melted into it, wrapping her arms around his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for so long." "Then why did you not?" Julia asked. "Because I wanted you to choose it. I wanted you to choose me, not because you felt you had no other option, but because you truly wanted to." "I choose you," Julia said. "I choose this life with you." That night they became husband and wife in every sense of the word. Gideon was tender and patient, taking his time, making sure Julia felt safe and cherished. Afterward, Julia lay in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you all right?" Gideon asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. "I am more than all right," Julia said. "I am happy." And she was. She was truly happy for the first time in as long as she could remember. Not the superficial happiness of parties and social engagements, but the deep contentment that came from being with someone who truly knew and valued her. "I love you," Gideon said quietly. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you in town that first day. I know it is soon to say it, and you do not have to say it back, but I needed you to know." Julia lifted her head to look at him. In the dim firelight, she could see the sincerity in his face, the vulnerability. This strong, capable man was offering her his heart completely. "I love you too," Julia said, and as she said it, she knew it was true. Somewhere between the altar and this moment, between the stranger who had taken her hand and the man who held her now, she had fallen in love with Gideon Fletcher. Gideon pulled her closer and kissed her forehead. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret those words." As summer faded into autumn, Julia and Gideon's love deepened and strengthened. They worked together to prepare for winter, preserving vegetables from the garden, cutting and stacking wood, making sure the cabin was well insulated against the coming cold. Julia continued to visit her family regularly, sometimes with Gideon, sometimes alone. Sarah had turned 17 and was being courted by a young man from a neighboring ranch. Timothy had grown taller, shooting up like a weed. Her father seemed more relaxed, relieved of some burden now that he knew Julia was well cared for. In late September, Julia realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was stress or the change in her lifestyle. But when a second month passed and she began feeling queasy in the mornings, she knew what it meant. She was pregnant. Julia did not know how to feel at first. She was only 18, married less than 4 months. But as she sat in the rocking chair that had been her mother's, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, she felt joy blossoming. This was Gideon's child, a product of the love they had built from nothing. She told Gideon that evening after dinner. He was sitting at the table reviewing accounts from the ranch. Julia came and sat beside him, taking his hand. "Gideon, I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Julia assured him. "Better than fine. I am pregnant." Gideon stared at her for a long moment, and Julia watched emotions play across his face: shock, joy, fear, love. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Julia said, laughing through sudden tears. "Are you happy?" Gideon pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. "Happy does not begin to cover it. Julia, you have given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning with joy. And now this. I do not know what I did to deserve it all." "You walked forward when no one else would," Julia said simply. "You took my hand and changed my life." They held each other for a long time, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. They were going to be parents. Their family was growing. The pregnancy was not easy. Julia suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and Gideon hovered over her anxiously, trying to make her comfortable. As autumn turned to winter, the weather grew harsh, and Julia was grateful for the warm cabin and Gideon's care. Gideon became even more protective and attentive. He insisted on doing all the heavy work, would not let Julia lift anything or strain herself. He brought her tea and crackers in the morning to help with the nausea, made sure she was never too hot or too cold. "You are going to drive yourself mad with worry," Julia told him one evening as he fussed over adding another blanket to the bed. "I just want to make sure you are comfortable," Gideon said. "I am comfortable, and I am not made of glass. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. But you are not just any woman. You are my woman. And that is our child you are carrying. Forgive me if I am overly cautious." Julia softened and pulled him down to sit beside her. "I love that you care so much, but you need to trust that I will tell you if something is wrong. I promise I will not take unnecessary risks." Gideon nodded, though Julia could see he was still anxious. She realized that this pregnancy was bringing up fears in him, perhaps related to his own mother's death. She made a mental note to be patient with him, to remember that his worry came from love. As winter deepened and snow blanketed the land, Julia and Gideon spent long evenings by the fire. They talked about their hopes for the baby, argued playfully about names, made plans for the future. Gideon built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving delicate designs into the sides. Julia sewed tiny clothes, her heart full as she imagined the child who would wear them. Julia's father and siblings visited for Christmas, bringing gifts and good cheer. Sarah was excited about becoming an aunt, and even Timothy seemed interested in the coming baby. They spent Christmas Day eating Aunt Mary's cooking and singing carols. It was a perfect day, and Julia felt blessed beyond measure. As the new year of 1879 arrived, Julia grew rounder. By February, she could no longer see her feet, and getting comfortable in bed became a challenge. But through it all, Gideon was there, patient and loving. He rubbed her swollen feet, helped her into and out of chairs, and never complained when she woke him multiple times each night to help her to the outhouse. In early March, when the snow was beginning to melt and the first hints of spring were appearing, Julia felt the first contractions. They started in the afternoon, mild and far apart. Julia had been expecting this, had prepared for it, but still fear gripped her. "Gideon," she called, and he was there immediately, dropping the firewood he had been stacking. "Is it time?" he asked. "I think so," Julia said. Gideon's face went pale, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I will ride for the midwife. Your aunt said she would come when the time arrived." "Hurry," Julia said as another contraction hit. Gideon rode like the wind to town and returned with Aunt Mary and Mrs. Patterson, who had assisted with many births in the area. They took over the cabin with calm efficiency, boiling water, preparing clean linens, and generally making Julia as comfortable as possible. Gideon was banished outside, as was the custom, but Julia could hear him pacing on the porch. At one point, when she cried out in pain, she heard him at the door, demanding to be let in. "You stay out there, young man," Aunt Mary called. "This is woman's work." "That is my wife in there," Gideon protested, "and she is doing what women have done since Eve. Now stay put." Despite her pain, Julia smiled. She loved that Gideon wanted to be with her, even though it was not done. The labor was long and difficult. Hours passed, the pain growing more intense. There were moments when Julia thought she could not endure it, when she cried out for relief. But Aunt Mary held her hand and encouraged her, and Mrs. Patterson gave expert guidance. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky pink and gold, Julia gave one final push and felt the baby slide free. There was a moment of breathless silence, then a loud, indignant cry. "It is a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A healthy, strong boy." Julia began to cry, overwhelmed with relief and joy. Aunt Mary quickly cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Julia's arms. Julia looked down at her son's tiny, scrunched-up face and fell instantly, completely in love. "He is perfect," Julia whispered. "He is indeed," Aunt Mary agreed. "Now, shall we let that poor man outside come in and meet his son? I think he has worn a hole in your porch from all his pacing." Julia laughed weakly. "Yes, please." The door opened and Gideon burst in, his face stricken with worry. He crossed to Julia in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her face. "I am fine," Julia assured him. "Tired, but fine." "Would you like to meet your son?" Gideon's eyes went to the bundle in Julia's arms, and his expression transformed. Wonder, love, and awe chased across his features. "A son," he breathed. Julia carefully transferred the baby to Gideon's arms. He took the child with infinite care, as if he were made of spun glass. The baby had stopped crying and was looking up at his father with dark, unfocused eyes. "Hello, little one," Gideon said softly. "I am your papa, and I promise you I will always protect you and love you. You and your mama are the most precious things in my world." Julia watched Gideon with their son and felt her heart might burst. This was her family. This was the life she had never imagined that day at the altar, the life that had been born from heartbreak and transformed into joy. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on one. Gideon looked down at the baby, then back at Julia. "What about Gabriel?" Gideon suggested. "It means God is my strength. I feel like we have been given a gift we did not earn, and I want his name to reflect that." "Gabriel Fletcher," Julia said, testing it out. "I love it. Aunt Mary and Mrs. Patterson stayed for a few hours to make sure Julia and the baby were doing well, then departed with promises to check in the next day. Gideon refused to leave Julia's side, insisting on sleeping in the chair beside the bed so he could help with the baby during the night. Gabriel was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in stretches that allowed Julia to rest. Gideon was an attentive father, changing nappies without complaint, rocking the baby when he fussed, staring at him with open wonder. "I cannot believe he is ours," Gideon said one night as he watched Gabriel sleep in the cradle he had built, "that we made this perfect little person." "I know," Julia said. "It is extraordinary." Gideon came and sat on the edge of the bed, taking Julia's hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me this family, for loving me, for building this life with me. A year ago I was alone, drifting. Now I have everything I ever wanted." "We gave it to each other," Julia said. "You saved me that day at the altar, Gideon, but I think I saved you too. We saved each other." Gideon leaned down and kissed her gently. "I love you, Julia Fletcher. I love you too." As spring bloomed into summer and Gabriel grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby, Julia often reflected on the strange path her life had taken. If Marcus had shown up at the church that day, she would be living a very different life. She probably would have been miserable, married to a man who did not truly love her. Instead, she had Gideon, who looked at her every day as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She had Gabriel, who filled their home with laughter and joy. She had a cabin in the mountains where she felt more at home than she ever had in town. One evening in July, as they sat outside watching the sunset while Gabriel played with wooden blocks Gideon had carved, Julia said, "Do you ever think about that day? The day we married?" "All the time," Gideon admitted. "I think about how close I came to not doing it. I sat in that church, watching you wait, and I debated with myself. I thought it was crazy, impulsive, that you would reject me and I would make everything worse. But something pushed me forward anyway." "I am glad it did," Julia said. "I am glad you were brave enough to take a chance on me." "On us," Gideon corrected. "I took a chance on us, and it was the best decision I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. Julia felt complete in a way she had not known was possible. She had love, family, purpose. "What do you think about having more children?" Gideon asked tentatively. Julia looked at him in surprise, then smiled. "I think I would like that, not right away, but eventually. I always wanted a large family." "So did I," Gideon said. "I want this house to be full of laughter and life." And it would be, Julia thought. They had years ahead of them, years to grow their family, to build their dreams, to love each other more deeply with each passing day. As the years passed, Julia and Gideon's life unfolded in beautiful ways. Gabriel grew into a curious, energetic toddler. When he was 2 years old, Julia became pregnant again, and the following spring they welcomed a daughter they named Grace. She had Julia's blonde hair and Gideon's gray eyes, and Gabriel adored his little sister. Gideon worked hard and saved carefully, and with the help of a loan from Mr. Morrison, he was able to buy a small piece of land adjacent to their cabin. He built a larger house with 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a covered porch where they could sit on summer evenings. Julia planted flowers around the house and expanded her vegetable garden. Sarah married her young man, a rancher named Thomas Fletcher, and Julia delighted in the coincidence of their shared last name. Timothy grew into a responsible young man and took over running the general store when their father retired. Thomas Newfield spent his later years contentedly, often visiting Julia and Gideon's growing family. When Gabriel was 6 and Grace was 4, Julia gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named James and Joshua. The house was indeed full of noise and laughter, just as Gideon had wanted. The children grew up strong and healthy, running wild through the meadows, helping with the animals, learning to ride almost before they could walk. Julia sometimes taught lessons to the children in the area, fulfilling her dream of being like her mother. She held classes in their home, teaching reading and arithmetic, sharing her love of books and learning. Gideon supported her completely, proud of his educated wife. On their 10th anniversary, Gideon surprised Julia by taking her back to the church in Gunnison. It had been expanded and improved over the years, but it was still the same building where their lives had changed forever. "I wanted to renew our vows," Gideon explained as they stood at the altar, the same place where he had first taken her hand. "I wanted to promise you again, but this time without the shock and the strangeness. I want you to know that I would choose you again, every time." Julia cried as they repeated their vows, this time knowing each other completely, loving each other deeply. When Gideon kissed her at the end, the small gathering of family and friends erupted into applause. "I would choose you again too," Julia told him. "Every time without hesitation." As they left the church hand in hand, Julia looked back at the altar and smiled. She thought about the frightened, humiliated girl who had stood there 10 years earlier and the stranger who had saved her. She thought about how love could grow from the most unexpected places, how joy could bloom from heartbreak. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Julia's father passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Aunt Mary followed him a few years later. Gideon's sister Margaret visited from St. Louis with her family, and the two families formed a bond that would last generations. Gabriel grew into a fine young man, serious and thoughtful like his father. He showed an aptitude for working with animals and eventually started his own horse breeding operation. Grace was spirited and creative, becoming a talented seamstress and eventually opening her own shop in town. James and Joshua were inseparable, getting into mischief together and keeping Julia on her toes. When Julia was 35, she and Gideon welcomed a surprise 5th child, another daughter they named Margaret after Gideon's mother. She was a calm, sweet-natured child who seemed to bring peace to their bustling household. Gideon prospered over the years. His small piece of land grew into a successful ranch. He was known throughout the county as a fair employer and an honest businessman. But he never lost sight of what mattered most. Every evening, no matter how busy he was, he made time to sit with Julia on their porch, to hold her hand and talk about their day. "You ever regret it?" Julia asked him one evening when they were in their 40s. Their children were all grown or nearly so, and the house was quieter than it had been in years. "Regret what?" Gideon asked. "Any of it. The impulsive proposal, the years of hard work, the sacrifices you made." Gideon turned to her, his face weathered by sun and wind but his eyes still as bright as ever. "Julia, marrying you was the single best thing I ever did. Every good thing in my life stems from that moment. Our children, our home, our life together. I would not change a single thing." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Neither would I." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Julia reflected on the journey they had taken. From strangers at an altar to partners in life, from a marriage of convenience to a love story that had spanned decades. They had built something beautiful from nothing, something lasting and true. Their grandchildren began to arrive, Gabriel's son first, then Grace's daughter. The house that had been built for Julia and Gideon's children became a gathering place for the next generation. Holidays were loud, chaotic affairs with dozens of people crowding around tables, children running underfoot, love filling every corner. On their 30th anniversary, Julia and Gideon's children organized a celebration. The whole town came, it seemed, to honor the couple whose unexpected marriage had become a testament to the power of commitment and love. Stories were told, toasts were made, and Julia and Gideon danced together just as they had at their wedding reception so many years before. "We have had a good life," Julia said as they swayed together. "The best life," Gideon agreed. "And it is not over yet. We still have years ahead of us." And they did. They watched their children build their own families, supported their grandchildren's dreams, and remained each other's best friends and greatest loves. They took walks together through the meadows they had explored as newlyweds, sat by the creek where Julia had first begun to find peace, and every night they fell asleep in each other's arms. When Julia was 60 years old, she became ill with a fever that the doctors could not fully explain. For several frightening days, Gideon sat by her bedside, holding her hand and refusing to leave. Their children gathered, worried and praying. But Julia's strength, the same strength that had carried her through heartbreak and built a family from nothing, pulled her through. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," she told Gideon when she was recovered, managing a weak smile. "Good," Gideon said fiercely, tears in his eyes. "Because I am not ready to let you go. I will never be ready." They celebrated their 40th anniversary with their family around them. Gabriel had given them 8 grandchildren. Grace had 5. The twins had 7 between them, and Margaret had just welcomed her first. The house overflowed with life and love, a legacy of that day when a cowboy had walked forward and taken the hand of a woman in need. As Julia looked around at her family, at the life she and Gideon had built, she felt nothing but gratitude. She thought about Marcus sometimes, wondered whatever became of him. She had heard years ago that he had married a woman in Denver, but that it had not lasted. She felt no satisfaction in that, only a distant sadness for the man who had never learned to appreciate what he had. But mostly, she thought about Gideon, about the courage it had taken for him to step forward that day, about the patience and kindness he had shown her as they learned to love each other, about the decades of faithfulness and partnership that had followed. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked, coming to stand beside her on the porch. "Everything," Julia said. "Our life, our family, how blessed we have been." Gideon wrapped his arm around her waist, and Julia leaned into him, still fitting perfectly against his side after all these years. "I walked into that church hoping to see you one more time," Gideon said quietly. "I walked out with a wife and the future I had always dreamed of. If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a thing." "Neither would I," Julia said. She turned to look up at him, this man who had transformed her life with a single act of courage. "I love you, Gideon Fletcher. I have loved you for 40 years, and I will love you for whatever time we have left." "I love you too, Julia. You are, and always have been, the greatest blessing of my life." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, surrounded by the sound of their grandchildren playing and their children talking. It was a perfect moment, a snapshot of a life well lived and a love well earned. Years continued to pass. Gideon and Julia grew old together, their hair silver, their movements slower, but their love undimmed. They celebrated their 50th anniversary with their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the same church where they had married, and once again, People talked about the incredible story of the jilted bride and the cowboy who had saved her. But Julia knew it was not quite that simple. Yes, Gideon had saved her that day, but she had saved him too. They had saved each other, really, from loneliness and purposelessness. Together, they had built something remarkable. When Julia was 72 years old and Gideon was 80, they still lived in the house he had built, though their children had tried many times to convince them to move to town where they could be looked after more easily. But Gideon and Julia were stubborn, insisting on maintaining their independence as long as possible. One spring evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Gideon suddenly squeezed Julia's hand. "Julia, I want you to know something," he said. "What is it?" Julia asked, hearing something serious in his tone. "If I could live my life over again, knowing everything that would happen, every joy and every sorrow, I would not change a single moment. Because every moment led me to you, and you have made every day of my life worth living." Julia felt tears spring to her eyes. "Oh, Gideon, you have given me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You took my hand when I needed you most, and you have never let go." "And I never will," Gideon promised. They sat together as the stars began to appear, holding hands just as they had on their wedding day more than 50 years earlier. The circle was complete, the journey full of more love and joy than either of them had thought possible. In the years that followed, age took its inevitable toll, but Julia and Gideon faced it together, just as they had faced everything. When walking became difficult, they sat together. When hearing failed, they held hands. When memories began to fade, they reminded each other of the important things: that they loved each other, that they had built something beautiful, that their life together had been a gift. Gideon passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 86, Julia beside him holding his hand. The entire county came to his funeral, paying respects to a man who had been known for his integrity, his kindness, and his devotion to his family. Julia stood at his grave, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and though her heart was broken, she was also grateful. They had had more than 50 years together, years full of love and purpose. Julia lived another 5 years, surrounded by her family who made sure she was never alone. She spent her days in the rocking chair that had been her mother's, telling stories to her great-grandchildren about their grandfather, about the day he had walked forward in a church and changed the course of her life. "He was the bravest man I ever knew," Julia would say. Not because he could ride or shoot or do any of the things men prided themselves on, but because he was not afraid to love, to commit, to put another person's needs before his own. When Julia was 77 years old, she passed away peacefully, her children around her. She was buried next to Gideon, their graves marked with a single headstone that read, "Gideon and Julia Fletcher, beloved husband and wife. Their love was a testament to courage, faith, and the power of taking a chance." The legacy they left behind was substantial. Their children all built good lives, raising families of their own and passing down the values their parents had instilled. The ranch Gideon had built continued to prosper through the generations. The story of their marriage became part of local legend, told and retold as an example of how love could grow from the most unexpected places. But more than buildings or land or even stories, Julia and Gideon left behind something intangible but infinitely more valuable. They left the knowledge that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the doorways to the best, that courage and kindness can change everything. That love, real love, is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about choosing each other every day, through every challenge. In that small church in Gunnison, Colorado, on a summer day in 1878, a woman had stood at an altar alone, and a man had walked forward to take her hand. Neither of them could have known what would follow, the decades of love and family and joy that would spring from that single moment of courage. But they had trusted, they had chosen each other, and they had built a life that became a testament to the transformative power of love. Their story was not about a woman who needed saving or a man who played hero. It was about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who took a chance on something uncertain, and who discovered that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unexpected first chapter. And so their story became part of the fabric of Gunnison, part of the history of the Wild West, a reminder that even in rough times and wild places, love could flourish and grow into something extraordinary. The cowboy who took a chance and the woman who chose to trust him had proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments, and that true love, once found, could last not just a lifetime but beyond it, in the hearts and memories of all those they left behind.